Well, hello, my name is Matt Arnold. So today I would like to talk to you about inclusion of people with autism in the evangelical churches. So first, let's kind of get a big picture of what we're talking about, though, when we talk about people with autism. So worldwide, about 1% of the world's population is estimated to have autism. Obviously, in a lot of the parts of the world, autism is not a formal diagnosis. They might have other names for it. That's why this is merely an estimate. In the United States, about 1 in 59 births is now estimated as of 2018 to have autism as a diagnosis. And obviously that is also a spectrum. So that can be either very mild or very severe. And that equates to about 3.5 million people in the United States. And using those numbers, we can deduce that in King County, about 37,000 individuals have autism spectrum disorder. But since we're not talking about statistics, we're talking about people, let's put a face to some of these numbers. Actually, first we're going to talk about the church. Since we're talking about the church, King County has over 2 million people in just this county alone. Of those, about 240,000 people attend an evangelical church. So if we use those numbers again, we can estimate that about 4,000 people in King County, almost 5,000, actually identify as being part of the evangelical church as an individual with autism who would go to an evangelical church if they had the opportunity to do so, or identifies as part of that faith. But so now, we're not talking about statistics, we're talking about a person. So, a face to go with this. This is Naomi Joy Arnold. So she was born in 1998, and she has autism spectrum disorder. We're going to learn a little bit more about her. We have a picture of her when she was, a little after she was first diagnosed here. She was about 4 years old, and then this is her more recently and her with her older sister. Who's really old. So let's look at some family statistics now and kind of help tie this together. So the typical divorce rate between Washington and California is about 40 to 50%. Already pretty high, right? However, if you add families with somebody with autism, that number jumps up to between 80 to 90% divorce rates. 9 out of 10 families who have somebody with autism in their family get divorced. That's pretty significant. So let's talk about maybe some main causes for why those numbers jump so high. So one of the big things is differing opinions of what that diagnosis means, and as well as parenting styles. There's a large lack of knowledge of how to support people with autism, especially from a parental standpoint. So you have the one parent who says, well, they're just acting out, we just need to get more strict. And another person who says, no, the doctor says we need to do X, Y, Z. So you get a lot of that conflict in there. Also being part of this outsiders club. If you're a parent with a child with autism, it's a lot harder to relate to other parents who don't have those kind of significant challenges. That also leads into lack of child support. It's harder to find educated caregivers who can support an individual with autism, and lack of social support. Kind of tying back into that outsiders club, a lot of times people with kids with autism lose friends. They lose their peers who they had as supports because they can't relate, and then they spend all their time in therapies and all their time supporting their child, and eventually they just become ostracized. But again, we're not talking about statistics, so let's put some faces to this. So this is Terry and Terry Arnold. So they're the parents of Naomi Joy Arnold. And they actually are part of the evangelical church starting back in the 80s, shortly after they first got married. So let's kind of take a look at a little bit of their story. So starting in 1980, they started attending an evangelical church on a regular basis. Then Naomi was diagnosed with autism in 2000. And in 2001, they moved out of the area that they had been in when they had Naomi, and they were fortunate enough to find a church that was willing to support Naomi as a young child in nursery. And that lasted until 2006, when they moved again, and unfortunately the area they moved to, they hunted and hunted for churches that would be welcoming to Naomi, but were unsuccessful. The churches that they went to, Naomi, as somebody with autism, would maybe make some sounds that people were uncomfortable with. She would make stimming motions that people were uncomfortable with. And basically they were told at all these different churches, we can't support her in this nursery, in this child's church, in this program. And then essentially, after searching for a little over a year, they finally decided, you know what, we need this support system that we have from our church congregation. So Naomi got left at home. They had to either begin taking turns going to church, so they weren't able to get that connection together at church, or they had to pay people to watch Naomi so they could go together. So that was a strain on them in either way. So let's take a look at what this progression was here. So first, you have the loss of a church. So you have this child with autism, you lose that support of the church. This leads to loss of that support both socially as well as environmentally with those natural supports and caregiving supports in a lot of cases. For most parents, church is a time that they can spend together in something that's meaningful for them, knowing that their child is taken care of. And for many parents with autism, that's just not the case. That often leads to anxiety, depression, and stress, which often leads to divorce. So this begs the question, what can we do to help these families get the support that they need? So first, we have to look at the church itself. So the first thing to do is to find and train volunteers. So that can look a number of ways. Some churches who have done this successfully have leaders who already have a pretty good network of people that they support, who they can say, hey, you know what, you're somebody who's really empathetic. I feel like you would be really good at helping people who have autism. The buddy system is something that's worked very well. And that's where somebody, let's say in a youth group, is identified as somebody who's really empathetic and really good at supporting people, and they're identified as a buddy for somebody who comes in with autism to help them navigate that environment and help them integrate in a really positive way. But then also having some trained caregivers at a higher level who receive more training, who can help be that one-to-one support if needed. Changing the infrastructure of a church. This is where we tend to find a whole lot of pushback. And how can we make it to where the building itself is accessible? That can be maybe having a quiet room in the church where if somebody gets overstimulated, they have a place they can just go relax and kind of decompress for a little bit. It can even be offering services that have a lower lighting. You know, the volume is down a little bit. It's a lot less overstimulated. Some churches have begun offering that, but again, normally it's typically much earlier in the day. That's a lot harder for parents to get out the door on time with. Also educating the congregation. So that's telling people, you know what, if somebody comes in and we want to be welcoming to everybody. We want to make sure that everybody feels welcome and not ostracized. And educating what does autism look like. As a spectrum, there's a lot of different ways it can present. So providing that education. And then finally, advertise. There's a lot of evangelical churches that are now starting to get on board with developing these programs and supports, but they're not getting the word out. So if there's parents out there who are not aware that these are supports that exist, then it essentially just goes to waste. So making sure that those are in place to get the word out and bring people in who need that support is a major key factor. So then we have to ask, how can we as individuals sitting in this room help with this? And one of the big ways is to be knowledgeable. Know what it looks like. What is autism? What are the different ways it can present? And what are some simple ways that we can help be a mentor and a peer to individuals with autism? Referring to people to supports, and that can be religious or not. If you're aware of somebody who church is really important to them, helping them, maybe Google some churches that have that support. Can also be referrals to the ARC of King County, DSHS, and other supports that might help them grow their social and support network. And then getting involved is important. Talking to churches, if you're a part of one, asking, do you have a program? If not, what would it look like to develop that? And thank you very much.